Good afternoon, and welcome to the second in what is two lectures that the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies is hosting. I should first of all recognize the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Bonnie Dugan, who is sitting to my right and who is one of the co-sponsors of this event. Professor Dugan, very early in the game, gave us a very generous contribution, which has helped to make this evening possible. Thank you again, Bonnie. And I see at least two ambassadors from the Jamaican Ambassadorial Corps. I don't know if you define yourself in that way, but I'm certainly defining you tonight. Tony Johnson and Richard Bernal, ambassadors, welcome. And if there are any others in the room, please indicate. Welcome. I am going to do the introduction I did yesterday evening and do one more, in that many of you may not have been here. Those who were here, my apologies, but we'll just go over our guests. The talk this evening is going to begin with Earle Scarlett, but I also want to mention that we have managed to not so much twist her arm, because that wouldn't be appropriate, but Barbara Scarlett, who is his spouse, but also a diplomat in her own right, a former United States diplomat, will be part of the discussion this afternoon, and she is in the front row. And Barbara, welcome this evening. And the title of the talk will be A Diplomat's Quiver, Handling the Unpredictable. And what we want out of this, and this Earle and I discussed at length, is that here we have somebody who is a highly experienced diplomat with the most powerful country in the world, but whose origins also lie in the small island of Jamaica. And we thought it would be interesting if he were to tell us a little bit about the diplomatic experience and what it is that diplomats do and how they do it, and not only just in general, but from his perspective and his experience, representing the interests of the United States of America. And that would be the basis for some questions and hopefully a conversation this evening between himself and now also Barbara, who we hope will give as much input as possible. And the people present in this room around the whole question of the art of diplomacy and foreign affairs, so to speak, as well, hopefully, if time allows, for us to get to some of the questions from the last session, which perhaps were not answered at that time. So I want you to be prepared to use the mics in the audience as soon as he's finished speaking, and to address your questions in that frame and as a conversation that I hope we can have this evening. Earle Scarlett is a very interesting person. Born in Jamaica, he will tell you, born in, we would say under the clock. Not quite the clock, but close to Sabina Park. He grew up in Kingston and went to both Wilmer's Prep and Wilmer's Boys School. He, in upper six, I think, or lower six, went to the United States and spent the rest of his life there, going, he tells me, to the same school that one Colin Powell, another student of Jamaican descent, attended at an earlier time than he did. He has served in the United States Foreign Service in a variety of capacities and also taught extensively at various institutions in the United States involved in the training of diplomats and the like. I mentioned some of the highlights of Earle's career. He served in the Department of State from 1976 to 2004 as the State Department's Senior Advisor for International Affairs at the Air University Maxwell Air Force Base, Montgomery, Alabama. And prior to this, he was Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Dublin, Ireland. He was also Director of Political Training at the Department of State's George P. Shultz Foreign Affairs Training Center after several years of immersion in Balkan affairs. He served in Bosnia, and a lot of his career centers around the experience in Bosnia as a political advisor for the civilian implementation of the Dayton Peace Plan. In Belgrade, Yugoslavia, as deputy head of the International Conference on the former Yugoslavia Border Monitoring Mission, and earlier as political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Mr. Scarlett served also as political officer twice in Brazil, first during the transition from military to civilian rule, and second during the rise of Lula to power. And in the Philippines, famously, he tells me, during the overthrow of President Marcos, and also in Cameroon. In the State Department, he was a Foreign Service examiner, desk officer for China, handling Tibet, and during the Tiananmen Square incident, he was also involved, and desk officer for Somalia and the Horn of Africa. He was also a State Department Dean Rusk Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, where he taught courses on ideology and the conduct of diplomacy, and was coordinator for an all-day conference on educating minorities for careers in foreign affairs, among many other educational posts that he served in the State Department. Since his retirement, he has lectured extensively, including at Emory University in New Delhi, India, at Columbia University. And much of his work has centered on looking at the disintegration of Yugoslavia and regional stability in the Balkans, among many other things. He has also worked as visiting professor at the University of Bologna, Forlì campus in Italy, in their interdisciplinary masters in Eastern European studies. Now, I could go on and on, but I think you get the picture. Barbara Scarlett was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, and grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, a place known to many people who know for its famous institute. She taught public school in Harlem, New York City, did her MA at the University of London, and at the another MA at the U.S. National Defense University. Her diplomatic career emphasized culture and the press, and she has been posted in the Cameroon, Brazil twice, the Philippines, ex-Yugoslavia, and Ireland, in tandem with her husband, Earle. She has worked in Washington on Latin American affairs, on East and West African affairs, and on Middle East affairs and South Asian affairs, and has received numerous awards. I didn't mention any of Earle's awards, but I assure you there are many. Among Barbara's awards, the Superior Honor Award for Developing Strategy for the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, and the Order of Chivalry, which is Brazil's Supreme Labor Court Award for her work on arbitration issues. I mention this only to indicate to you that both Earle and Barbara are well-recognized and well-accomplished career diplomats. And with that, I turn it over to Earle Scarlett to begin with his talk tonight, followed by our discussion, A Diplomat's Quiver, Handling the Unpredictable. Earle.
Welcome to those who decided to come back for the second part of the marathon. My talk today will be brief. As I mentioned last time, the paper I'd written, which I presume you have picked up, was where I had some ideas that I wanted to share with you, and I mentioned that with your questions it will be fine-tuned, so therefore you are stakeholders in this paper. If your questions tell more about people than answers, because insightful questions really trigger great discussion. I'm going to be brief in the introductory section, because what I'd love to do is to entertain discussions in response to some anecdotal references based upon working in crisis situations. Now, I had written a short essay here in Jamaican Observer some years ago, and I mentioned in the first line that diplomacy was the second oldest profession. And I mean that sincerely. I have no idea what the first is, but in any event, I know it's the second. And if you begin to think about the relations you have with individuals whom you love, and the types of intense argumentation that develops over minor issues, you can begin to see the complexity of international relations. And I see some dear friends of mine, I see Trevor Gordon-Somers over there, those difficult situations that you face in your personal life, multiplied representing a state in the conduct of relations among states. And then when you are representing, allegedly, the most powerful state in the history of mankind, it is said, then your burden becomes equal to those who represent smaller states with big things at stake. Let's get some perspective on this, that because the United States has military might and persuasive power and various things that we mentioned about President Obama, we also must recognize that small and middle states have major issues also on their plates. And their diplomats are as skilled, as I've found over the years, as those from my own country, my adopted country. I want to underscore that because the misconception exists that talent only lies in powerful states. In fact, I sometimes wonder if it's not the reverse. It's a challenge for diplomats. I remember a conversation I had with a Finnish diplomat and an Ecuadorian diplomat when we were fellows at Georgetown University. And they said to me, Earle, when you want to see somebody powerful in the country in which you're assigned, you can do it easily. It's a little more difficult for us. And I never forgot that. It's very insightful. Now, diplomacy is really a question of tact. Diplomacy also involves building trust among people that you want to be helpful to and they helpful to you. It is not an arcane concept, but it involves a lot of complexities, as you can imagine, and especially when you're engaged in multilateral diplomacy. Bilateral diplomacy, you have a menu of issues in common, and some of them in common with your partner, the country in which you're dealing. And then you have a number of issues that you don't see eye to eye on. And you have to find some peaceful dialogue with that interlocutor, to use a fancy diplomatic term, and reach some kind of common ground. It's easier said than done, but that's what diplomats have to do. The final extension of diplomacy is when it breaks down, you have a threat of war. And war is just another aspect of the total conduct of relations among and between countries. So diplomats play a critical role. And they play a critical role in foreign countries to which they're deployed. And they have to develop a flexibility and an understanding of the culture and what drives the aspirations of their leaders in foreign countries and their publics. Because there are two elements to diplomacy that's often defined these days more clearly. And I think President Obama, as I was saying last time, has come to terms with it. And I think Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, understood it when she said that United States Department of State in the conduct of our affairs has to do with defense, diplomacy, and development. And development is a key word in this, because the lack of development causes a whole range of instabilities in the world, as you can begin to imagine. So we are deployed overseas in embassies and consulates general, and even interest section we have in the United States. For example, in Cuba, we have an interest section. It does not have diplomatic status as we understand it. And we have a similar type of arrangement in Taiwan. As you can begin to imagine, our relations with Beijing and our relations with Taiwan. You are beginning to sense the digital dexterity that one needs in addition to verbal dexterity. So those are how we are deployed. And we're deployed in terms of what the United States declares as its national interests. And these interests vary from administration to administration, primarily on the basis of emphasis. There are no great seismic shifts from one administration to the other. One of the consistent features of my dealing with diplomats overseas and government officials and other members of the public is they always say, well, when you have a transition, a new government in Washington, a new administration, are you going to have some swerves, major shifts in the degree of emphasis you place on some of the subjects on your menu that you bring to us? And if you study a bit of American history, you'll see changes, but they are not, as I said, seismic. However, we are facing a world now, as we mentioned last time, that there is a shift. The center of gravity is shifting from Europe as the pivotal region into the Pacific Rim, with China and of course including South Asia. And there are demographic reasons for it. There are a host of reasons for it: economic reasons, financial reasons, political reasons, geostrategic reasons, and so forth. So diplomats have to be nimble and come in full consonance with the administration's overall policy. And that policy is articulated in the National Defense, National NSS, National Security Strategy. And that National Security Strategy is not set in concrete, because it's a sort of overview of the things that need to be subsumed under that overarching policy. And that, as I said, that policy varies and changes and fine-tuned due to contingencies, the unexpected, the imponderable, the new, and the not so new. It is not just hackneyed to say that the most permanent thing in life is change. So you've got to be able to change, and you have to be able to adapt to situations, understand your publics and so forth, and the aspirations of the countries in which you're dealing. This is complicated further in multilateral diplomacy. In a multilateral diplomacy with multipolar developments in the world, with new emerging states, so forth, rising and having a greater clout, that will lead to the reconfiguration, in my estimation, of the National Security Council in the United Nations. These are the multiple aspects of reality of life that diplomats have to be able to handle. And in many instances, language training and deep understanding of culture and deep understanding of what motivates people, There are some commonalities across the globe, and there are some peculiarities. And it is you as a discerning diplomat trained to perceive and discern and look beneath the smoke screen to understand the dynamics that lie and are critical for the decision-making process in that country and your own country in reaction to those realities. Now, some of the tools, some of the things that diplomats do, aside from representing his or her country, is to explain America and explain a changing America. Because some people have fixed views, some Hollywood views about the United States. Sometimes disinformation is planted in newspapers all over the world. Barbara will tell you of an anecdote with a Smirnoff on that score. So you have to explain and you have to rebut whatever is fallacious as being presented to publics abroad, be they in the media. Now we have the internet, you know, and Facebook, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a new dynamic, and it causes you as a diplomat to be more skillful in quickly understanding and explaining to your end users, interested parties, about what's transpiring. And a very critical aspect of it is the notion of writing analytical reports to end users who need to understand on-the-ground information, candid, frank, and not what Washington always wants to hear, or New York, or other embassies. You have to do it with integrity, your integrity. And when you maintain your integrity, people want to read what you're writing. No, you haven't read the reams of writings that we have done over the years, because only now they're available to you through Snowden and WikiLeaks. Now you begin to, I brought a cable here to show you called David Bruce's Long Cable. If you read it, it's a treatise. And he was ambassador then in Paris in 1951. George F. Kennan, when he was a political counselor in our embassy in Moscow, wrote the whole containment policy. It was written by George F. Kennan. So that gives you some idea. Now, what I want to do is to invite you to enjoy some anecdotal personal experiences that illustrate and elucidate and sometimes obfuscates what we have experienced. Now, Barbara, would you like to start? Thank you. I always know what it means when she raises her right hand like this. All right, let's take the case of Somalia. Somalia is a country that's now Ricardo. Somalia. Somalia is a country now that has gained much prominence in the world. But when I was working in Somalia, the dictator at that time was Siad Barre. And it is important to know that the people of Somalia are primarily Issas and Afars. Understanding Africa is perhaps the most instructive or most useful thing you can have as a diplomat to understand the world. Trust me on that. Understanding the complexities that underlie decision-making in many African countries. You know there are about 15 dictators in Africa today who have been in power for over 15 years. And that, in some extent, explains some of President Obama's skepticism on, dealing with some of these people. But however, suffice it to say that Somalia is located in a geographically important position. It's in the Horn of Africa. If you don't understand geography, then you cannot understand geopolitics. If you don't understand geography, and I just don't mean where capitals are, I mean relief geography, I mean minerals, exports, all of the things that come from the terrain of many of these countries. Because you have to develop a profile of countries based upon a number of criteria in addition to national product. So Somalia is located where the pirates are today. But before the pirates came on the scene, I was working on Somalia. And I'm going to tell you that Siad Barre came from one of the clans of Somalia. Somalia doesn't have more than, really doesn't have tribes. It has clans. They all belong to Afars or Isas. Unlike, say, Nigeria, you have the Fulani, the Hausa, you know, the Ibibio, etc., Yoruba, and so forth. And in different countries, in Ivory Coast, the Baule, etc., Ashantis in Ghana and so forth. Somalia has the Isas and the Afars. And there are three Somalias. There was Italian Somalia, I say that, controlled by the colonial power. And there was British Somalia, which is today called Somaliland. And the other Somalia is called Djibouti, French. The United States has military bases in Djibouti because it looks across to Aden in Yemen, what is now, was formerly Aden, now Yemen. It looks across here. And that's important because oil tankers leaving here, destined for South China Sea, which is another problematic area. As you know, the Chinese are quarreling with the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Filipinos about who owns the Spratly Islands and so forth. It's a contentious problem, but it's linked to this sort of thing, that there are some choke points along here, and Socotra here, and then coming around the Malacca Straits to bring